Harlem never slept, but it did listen. On certain nights, when the streetlights flickered and the music spilled out of basement clubs like steam from a subway grate, Harlem leaned in. It listened for footsteps that didn't belong, for whispers that carried weight, for the sound that always came before history cracked open. That night, the sound was a gunshot. But before the bullet tore through the air, before blood hit the pavement and names were sealed in a legend, there was a man standing watch. A man most people never noticed. A man whose job was to stay invisible. His name was rarely spoken aloud. In Dean Martin's world, bodyguards weren't supposed to have names. They were meant to be shadows, broad-shouldered, silent, loyal. This one had been all three for nearly a decade. Harlem knew his face, even if it didn't know his name. He was the man who stood half a step behind Dean at the Cotton Club entrance. The man who scanned every room before Dean ever smiled. The man whose eyes never stopped moving. Until the night they fired him. Dean Martin didn't fire people casually. In Harlem, firing a man like that wasn't just termination. It was a message. It meant something had gone wrong at a level no one talked about. Money missing. Loyalty questioned. A rumor that traveled faster than truth. The bodyguard was called upstairs just after midnight. No shouting, no threats, no violence. That was the part that unsettled him most. Dean sat behind a polished desk, cigarette burning low, eyes calm in a way that made men nervous. Two others were in the room, quiet, well-dressed, unfamiliar. Outsiders in a Harlem room always meant trouble. "You're done tonight," Dean said, voice smooth, almost regretful. No hard feelings, no explanation, no chance to speak. A small envelope slid across the desk, cash inside, neat and final. The bodyguard understood immediately. This wasn't about performance. This was about trust. And once trust cracked, it never healed. He nodded once. Professionals didn't beg. He turned and walked out, past rooms he'd guarded, doors he'd opened, men who wouldn't meet his eyes. By the time he stepped onto the street, Harlem felt different. Colder, like the city had already made its decision about him. He didn't go far. That was his mistake. Point blank meant no warning. No dramatic standoff. No time for regret. The gun was already raised when he realized what was happening. A single shot, close enough that the powder burned his coat. Close enough that witnesses would later argue whether he even saw it coming. He fell where he stood. For a moment, Harlem froze. Then everything changed. The body didn't stay anonymous for long. Word spread fast, too fast for coincidence. This wasn't just a firing gone wrong. This was an execution dressed up as discipline. And Harlem understood the implication immediately. If Dean Martin was willing to let a trusted protector be erased, no one was untouchable anymore. Within hours, whispers turned into accusations. Accusations turned into alliances. Men who had stood neutral for years started choosing sides. Club owners closed early. Runners doubled their routes. Guns that hadn't been drawn in months were cleaned and loaded again. One gunshot didn't just kill a man. It exposed a fracture that had been hiding under Harlem's rhythm. And somewhere, watching from a distance, Bumpy Johnson listened. He hadn't ordered the hit. He didn't need to, but he understood what it meant better than anyone else. In Harlem, violence was language, and this sentence was loud. Dean Martin had crossed a line, whether he meant to or not. By morning, Harlem wasn't the same place it had been the night before. Power didn't feel stable anymore. It felt contested, like a crown sitting crooked on a head that might not keep it. And the bodyguard, nameless in life, unforgettable in death, became the spark. The man no one saw had just forced everyone to look. Morning didn't bring clarity. It brought fear. Harlem woke up knowing something fundamental had shifted, even if no one could yet explain how. The streets were louder than usual, but the noise felt forced. Laughter a half-second too late. Music turned up to drown out thoughts. People talked around the gunshot, not about it. That was always the first sign of trouble. By sunrise, 3 different versions of the story were already circulating. In one, the bodyguard had been skimming money. In another, he'd talked to the wrong people. In a third, the one whispered only behind closed doors. He had known too much and stayed loyal anyway. That version scared men the most. Dean Martin stayed inside. That too was noticed. Normally, Dean made a point of being seen after incidents. A calm walk, a public appearance, a message without words. I'm still here. This time the door stayed shut. No statements. No emissaries. No peace offerings. Silence is never neutral in Harlem. By noon, Bumpy Johnson had heard enough. He sat in the back room of a bar that didn't advertise its name, a place that served as neutral ground only because everyone agreed it was safer that way. The walls were yellowed with age and smoke, the table scarred with old knife marks, history etched into cheap wood. Men waited for him to speak. Bumpy didn't rush. He stirred his coffee slowly, listening as others talked themselves into mistakes. He heard the fear beneath their bravado, the excitement beneath their caution. Everyone sensed opportunity. Everyone also sensed blood. That shot wasn't business, one man said. That was panic. Bumpy finally looked up. No, he said calmly. That was control, or someone pretending to have it. The room quieted. Bumpy knew Dean Martin well enough to understand the difference. Dean didn't kill out of rage. He killed when he felt cornered, or when he wanted to remind people that loyalty was mandatory, not optional. But this time, the message had misfired. Killing a bodyguard after firing him wasn't discipline. It was insecurity, and insecurity was contagious. By mid-afternoon, 2 separate crews tried to fill the vacuum the death had created. Both failed. One overplayed its hand. The other hesitated. Harlem punished both instincts equally. Meanwhile, the dead man's past began to surface. Someone remembered seeing him talk to a runner connected to the Italians downtown. Someone else swore he'd been seen near a numbers house that didn't answer to Dean or Bumpy. None of it was proven. None of it needed to be. In Harlem, suspicion didn't require evidence. It required timing, and the timing was perfect. Dean Martin's inner circle began to tighten. Men who'd once spoken freely now weighed every word. Loyalty tests multiplied. Errands became interrogations. Trust turned into surveillance. The more Dean tried to assert control, the more obvious it became that he was losing it. That night, a meeting was called, quiet, selective, dangerous. Bumpy didn't attend. That absence was louder than any gunshot. Dean noticed. For the first time since the bodyguard fell, something close to doubt crept in. Not fear, Dean wasn't built that way, but the realization that power wasn't responding the way it used to. Messages went unanswered. Promises felt thinner. Men nodded without conviction. Harlem was recalibrating, and the dead bodyguard, still unnamed, still unresolved, hung over every conversation like unfinished business. Late that evening, Bumpy finally moved. Not with violence, with information. A rumor was released carefully, like a blade slid across skin just enough to draw attention. The bodyguard had been loyal, completely loyal. Fired because someone claimed otherwise. Killed to make sure he couldn't defend himself. The rumor didn't accuse Dean directly. It didn't have to. By midnight, the story had hardened into belief. Dean Martin didn't just kill a man. He killed the wrong one. And Harlem, which tolerated brutality but despised waste, began to turn its back. Bumpy stood by his window that night, looking out over streets he knew better than any map could show. He understood what came next. This wasn't a war yet. It was positioning. The first domino had fallen. Others were leaning. And somewhere in the city, men were cleaning guns, not to shoot immediately, but to be ready when Harlem finally decided who would survive the change. Dean Martin made his move too late. By the time he realized Harlem was no longer waiting for his word, the city had already started answering questions without him. Power doesn't disappear all at once. It leaks. First in conversations that stop when you enter a room, then in deals that close without your name on them. Finally, in silence where respect used to live. Dean felt all three within 48 hours. He broke his own rule and summoned everyone. Not just lieutenants, not just trusted men, everyone who mattered. The meeting took place in a private club off 133rd Street, a place fortified more by reputation than locks. The kind of room where decisions were meant to feel final. Dean arrived early, sat at the head of the table, and waited. He wanted them to see patience, confidence, control. What he saw instead unsettled him. Men arrived in small groups, not alone. Chairs were taken farther from him than usual. Conversations continued longer than they should have before dying down. No one reached for a drink until Dean did, and even then, only a few followed. He began without ceremony. "The situation is handled," Dean said. "The man who died made choices. Bad ones." No one interrupted. No one agreed either. Dean pressed on. He explained loyalty. He explained consequences. He explained why decisive action kept organizations alive. His words were polished, practiced, everything that had worked for years. They fell flat. Finally, someone asked the question Dean had hoped would stay buried. If he was dirty, the man said carefully, "Why fire him first?" The room went still. Dean answered smoothly, "To be merciful." That was the wrong word. Mercy implied doubt. Doubt implied hesitation. And hesitation was the one thing Harlem never forgave in men who claimed authority. Dean saw it then, the shift. Not rebellion. Not defiance. Something worse. Disbelief. The meeting ended without resolution. No arguments. No explosions. Just men leaving with more certainty than they'd arrived with. Dean stayed behind, staring at the chair where his bodyguard used to stand. For the first time, the thought crossed his mind. What if they're right? That night, violence returned, not loudly but deliberately. A numbers house once loyal to Dean switched protection overnight. A shipment went missing and reappeared under a different banner. A runner vanished and turned up 2 days later working for someone else, acting like it had always been that way. Dean responded the only way he knew how. Force. 2 men were beaten. 1 was shot. Not killed, but close enough to make the message unmistakable. Dean wanted fear back in circulation. It didn't work. Fear without respect only accelerates collapse. Bumpy Johnson watched all of this without intervening directly. He didn't need to. Dean was doing the work for him. Every harsh response confirmed the narrative spreading through Harlem. Dean Martin was ruling by reaction now, not strategy. And then came the mistake that sealed everything. Dean ordered a hit, not on a rival, not on an outsider, on someone neutral. The man survived, but the order didn't stay secret. In Harlem, neutrality was sacred. Break that rule, and even enemies stopped pretending. Within hours, phones rang that Dean didn't control. Meetings happened he wasn't invited to. Old lines were redrawn without his consent. Bumpy finally spoke, quietly, privately, decisively. He didn't declare war. He declared stability. That was the brilliance of it. Where Dean offered punishment, Bumpy offered predictability. Where Dean demanded loyalty, Bumpy earned patience. Men didn't switch sides out of ambition. They switched out of relief. By the end of the week, Dean Martin was still alive. But he was finished. And the bodyguard, the man fired, then erased, had become something far more powerful in death than he'd ever been in life. He became the moment Harlem chose a different future. Dean Martin still believed he could fix it. That belief, more than enemies, more than rumors, more than bullets, was what doomed him. He told himself Harlem had turned before and come back. He told himself fear only needed time to settle. He told himself Bumpy Johnson was waiting for him to blink first. Men like Dean survived by believing their instincts were permanent assets, not expiring advantages. So he gambled, not with violence, not with money, with history. Dean reached out to names that hadn't been spoken in years. Old alliances, retired favors, men who owed him from a time when Harlem looked different and loyalty meant silence instead of strategy. He believed the past could rescue the present. It couldn't. Those men listened politely. They remembered Dean fondly. Some even respected him. But respect for who someone was never outweighs fear of who someone is becoming. And Dean was becoming unstable. The final meeting was arranged quietly. Neutral ground. No weapons in plain sight. Just conversation. That alone told Dean everything. This wasn't negotiation. It was evaluation. He arrived composed, dressed sharply, carrying the confidence of someone who refused to acknowledge the verdict forming against him. Bumpy was already there. They spoke like professionals, like men who understood that shouting was for amateurs. Dean framed the bodyguard's death as an unfortunate necessity, a misinterpreted act, A decision taken to preserve order. Bumpy didn't argue. That silence again. Dean talked longer than he should have. He offered compromises that revealed weakness. He promised restraint where authority should have been assumed. Finally, Bumpy spoke. "You didn't lose Harlem when you pulled the trigger," he said calmly. "You lost it when you forgot who you were protecting." That landed, because Dean knew it was true. The bodyguard hadn't been just muscle. He'd been a buffer, a stabilizer, a man whose presence told others, Dean doesn't act alone. Firing him publicly and killing him afterward had stripped that illusion away. Dean was exposed. The meeting ended without threats. Those were no longer necessary. By the following morning, Dean's operation still ran, but only on the surface. The money moved slower. The protection felt thinner. The respect was gone. Men followed instructions, not leadership. That's when Dean understood the truth no one wanted to say out loud. He wasn't being attacked. He was being replaced. And replacements don't announce themselves. They simply become reality. Dean disappeared from Harlem not with sirens or headlines, but with something far more humiliating: irrelevance. He moved quietly, lived carefully, surrounded himself with people who needed him instead of people who believed in him. The city didn't notice when he left. That was the final verdict. The bodyguard's name was eventually spoken, once, in a back room, without ceremony. No monument, no marker, just acknowledgement. That was enough, because Harlem remembered him not as a victim, but as the moment everything shifted. One gunshot, one mistake, one city deciding it was done being ruled by fear. Harlem didn't celebrate the change. That was how you knew it was real. When power truly shifted, there were no parades, no victory laps, no loud declarations. The streets simply exhaled. Clubs reopened without tension in the doorway. Runners moved without glancing over their shoulders every 10 seconds. Deals took longer, but they stuck. Violence didn't disappear. It became precise again. Predictable. Controlled. That was the difference. Bumpy Johnson never announced himself as the new order. He didn't need to. Order isn't something you proclaim. It's something people feel when they stop preparing for chaos. Within weeks, the story of Dean Martin stopped being told in present tense. That was the final humiliation. Men spoke of him the way they spoke of old street corners that no longer existed. Used to be here back in the day before things changed. His name became a reference point, not a factor. And the bodyguard? He became the line. Older men would say, "That was before the bodyguard got shot," or "That was after the bodyguard thing." The city divided time around his death the way it once divided blocks around territory. No one glorified him. No one dramatized his end. Harlem respected him the way it respected hard truths, quietly, permanently. Because his death taught the city something it had forgotten. Power without trust doesn't collapse loudly. It hollows out. Dean Martin had believed fear was enough. That as long as men were afraid of him, they would follow. What he failed to understand was that fear only works when it feels justified. The moment it feels wasteful, personal, impulsive, insecure, it turns toxic. Killing the bodyguard wasn't a show of strength. It was proof of isolation. And isolation is fatal in Harlem. Bumpy understood that better than anyone. He didn't replace Dean with terror. He replaced him with rhythm, predictability, boundaries that made sense. Harlem didn't need a king. It needed a custodian. The gunshot that night didn't just end a life. It ended an era where loyalty was demanded instead of earned. Years later, younger men would ask why things ran the way they did. Why certain rules were absolute. Why some lines were never crossed, no matter the provocation. The answer was always the same. Because once a man forgot what his protection meant. No names, no details, just a lesson. Harlem moved on, but it never forgot. Cities don't mourn individuals the way people do. They absorb them. They turn lives into warnings, mistakes into structure. That's how survival works on streets older than memory. One bodyguard stood watch. One gun fired too close. One decision exposed everything beneath it. And Harlem, listening as it always did, chose who deserved to stay.